Welcome to the House of Jesus. House of Jesus communities are those that are constantly aligning themselves to Jesus, the cornerstone. Accordingly, they preach and teach the words of Jesus, and they walk out his ways. The vision of this video series is to unpack Jesus' culture of godly love and equipping-based empowerment. As we do so, we will detail the biblical foundation for our convictions, as well as provide practical strategies for implementing the Master's ways. But be assured, walking out Jesus' ways is not a decision, but a lifelong calling and process. We are humbled that you are joining us on this quest. The sixth video is entitled The Equipping Value of Apprenticing and has been recorded in partnership with Drew Stedman, a church planting catalyst. This teaching unpacks the third value of Jesus' culture of equipping-based empowerment, namely patient apprenticing. Like his Father, Jesus patiently walked with and onboarded the 12, the 70, and a number of women into anointed ministry. As we summarize Jesus' ways, listeners will learn that apprenticing is a value modeled by God. Apprenticing is a competency-based process that equips servants to begin well. Apprenticing is also a practical and experientially based process. And apprenticing is a relational process that fosters the values of community. My prayer is that this resource accelerates your alignment to Jesus' ways. Today, we're jumping into one of the most important values that we see in Jesus is patient apprenticing. I know he's been incredibly patient with me for 50 years. And this really builds on the first two values that we have talked about, clarity and fit. It really is a process of seeing the vision that you have for ministry, finding the right people, and then being patient in your development of those individuals. And Drew, I can't help but think about a conversation that we had fairly recently as you were describing what you and Bethany are, how you're living out patient apprenticing. You were describing a vision for your children cooking breakfast for themselves. And then you began to unpack how you and Bethany have been partnering together to make that happen. I'd love for you to share that story because it really is so perfectly aligned to what we're talking about today.
So we have 4 children, and when we had them, we had the first 3. We had 0, 1, and 2 years old, and then had a little bit longer gap with our son. So for years and years and years, my mornings were spent almost entirely changing diapers, making a bunch of breakfast, cleaning up breakfast. So anything as far as me having the chance to work out, spend time with God, I had to get up. I still get up early, but it was chaos in the morning. So a couple of years ago, as our kids got a little older, we had this vision. I looked at my kids and said, they are capable of making their own breakfast. And it was this vision. So, if we're going to look at using our language here, there was some clarity about what I wanted to see happen. And that was that my children were able to cook a breakfast for themselves. Now, here's the challenge is I'm very grateful to be married to a woman who is conscious of the health of what my kids have. So a sugary cereal is not an option. So we wanted something more nutritious. So we have this nice, I think, gluten-free oatmeal that we wanted the kids to have that's a little better for them. And, they have fruit that goes with it. So it's not just as simple as pouring milk on cereal. I mean, we're talking breakfast that involves fire, that involves natural gas, that involves boiling liquids, that involves all kinds of stuff. So, but it's like there was some clarity that it needs to be a nutritious breakfast. I wanted my kids to have it. And then it's an issue of evaluating. I have 4 children, and I looked at it. And initially, my daughter, I think when we started this, she's 11 now, maybe she was 8 at the time. I felt really confident that she was old enough. And then the other girls a little younger, but felt like they were close. But when I started doing this, my son, he would have been 2 or 3. He obviously wasn't ready for it. So, I had to evaluate who actually has the gift and the maturity to handle an open flame. But then what we did is we started the process of let's teach them how to make their own oatmeal. And, and so it couldn't just be something where I told them, kids, go make your own oatmeal. I mean, if I do that, best case scenario, we're going to have a giant mess. Worst case scenario, the house burns down. So I had to model it. And you're going to get into some of your steps. And I think you could even take the story I'm telling you, and we can go back through and see some of the steps I took. But it had to be a process where I was gradually demonstrating, watching, holding them accountable, all of the different things, so that I could have the confidence that later I could sleep in on a Saturday morning and be confident that they could serve and make themselves a breakfast in a way that was safe, was going to get them the food that they needed, and that they would be able to do on their own. So I couldn't have done it without a clear goal. I couldn't have done it without a clear understanding of where my children were at, but I also couldn't have done it without a clear process of apprenticing them to where they could do it. And I think, the relevance in ministry, if you take my story, and this is what you're getting at, Charlie, is I think we have a tendency sometimes to want people to make oatmeal, but then we tell them to go figure it out with the natural gas and hope you don't burn the house down, and it's very possible. And this is a message for parents. Your kids can do a lot more than you think they can if you will patiently take the time to apprentice them. But if you don't take the time to apprentice them, and them could be your children, them could also be the staff members of your church, then you're tending to get a result that you don't want. And I think a lot of ministry, we swing way too much between not apprenticing at all and just throwing people into the woods, and then not releasing people at all because we've been burned too many times. In my case, that could actually be literal if I'm not careful.
Yeah, I think that, the 4 steps of apprenticing are so emblematic of what you're having to do as a parent. Like you said, you can't just go from having a vision to delegating or empowering Grace to make her own breakfast. You have to really go through the steps. And here are the 4 steps that people commonly associate with apprenticing. The first is I do and you watch. Secondly, we do it together. Third, you do it and I'll watch you. And lastly, you do it and others can watch and you can train. Maybe Grace is helping to train Josh. But one of the key elements that is so important to apprenticing is just dialoguing. And so you can see in this 4-step process that each of these steps ends with a process of dialogue. And you can ask Grace, okay, do you understand how to turn on the flame? The better question for her as you were training her is, what is your understanding of how to turn on the flame? Or let me see you do that on your own. So this 4-step process, just as you have highlighted, is a challenge sometimes. We want and hope to be able to get people to ramp up very quickly into ministry responsibilities. But even Jesus had this kind of process with the apostles and others he was investing in. And we see this in some levels of training. Come and see, come and follow me, remain in me. Now go, I am sending you. So even Jesus, over the course of several years, is seeing this gradual process of onboarding and ramping the apostles up into all that they're doing. So obviously, Drew, there are a number of scriptures where we can see examples of this type of life-on-life apprenticing. And I'd love to know which of these really stand out for you as a great example for us in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just looking at your list, I think that first and foremost is how common of a theme this is throughout Scripture, going all the way back into whether it's the Old Testament time with the patriarchs, all the way through the history of the church. We see this theme over and over again. But it's really Jesus with his apostles that I have consistently seen this. And you mentioned some of this in the previous slide, Charlie. But Luke 8, 9, and 10 stands out to me, and always it jumped out to me. And if you have a Bible, you can pull it out. If you look at Luke 8, 1, 9, 1, and 10, 1, where 8, 1, it describes Jesus he's going town to town, and he's healing people, preaching the good news of the kingdom. And it says the 12 were with him. And then in 9, 1, Jesus is sending out the 12. And then in 10, 1, he's sending out the 72. And it just stands out to me, this very clear intentionality. And I look at the ministry model of Jesus, of what was he doing for 3 years of earthly ministry? There was the public facing side of it, of him proclaiming the kingdom and healing people. But I actually think what he was maybe strategically doing was investing in 12 people who would be able to carry on that ministry that ended up forming the foundation of the church. And I love the adjective patient in front of apprenticing, because there's no other way of looking at the ministry of Jesus apart from a patient apprenticing of his disciples. There was not an assembly line. There was not a credential degree program. There was not, what he was doing was he was in the nitty gritty of life and ministry, repeatedly walking with them, showing them in a way that would eventually lead to their empowerment, what it meant to build the church and to be a part of seeing God's kingdom established on the earth. And so I look at that, and I think if this is what Jesus did as far as his leadership in the church, surely that needs to be the way that we understand our role of leadership in the church. So Charlie, as we get into this next slide and we start getting into a bit more of the steps and stages and process, something in your own story, just from my observation, watching you, I saw you and met with you early on when you came into Waco. Now you had years of ministry experience. And for those who don't know your background, both an MBA and an MDiv and years on staff at a large church, and had written a book at that point, been trained as a church consultant. So it was not an issue of you coming and joining our network, of you not having the experience. Yet there was still an apprenticing, I remember you joining the training school and meeting with people. So I'd love to know, for somebody who had had so much experience, why was this still an important step in your process when it clearly wasn't an issue of you were, still green, but a person who was actually very seasoned and accomplished even in ministry?
Yeah, sometimes we associate patient apprenticing with individuals who are younger and they just need to begin in a ministry. But at 58, Mary Lou and I moved to Boston and jumped into a church planting movement there. And we were truly outsiders. We were outsiders to the Northeast in Boston. We had never lived there before. We were outsiders to the crew that had been there for 15 plus years. We were outsiders to just relationally to those individuals. We had met them. I had been up there interviewing, and I knew who they were, but I didn't have really in-depth understanding of their philosophy of ministry. It wasn't on paper. There were many questions that I had asked, but many that I had not yet asked. And so there needed to be a process for me to enter into and get ramped into that ministry opportunity after I moved there. That particular process wasn't in place at the time. And so I actually sort of had to do it on my own and just ask questions and guide my own process of orientation. But each of these drivers, orientation, startup training, and belonging, have an important role in patient apprenticing. So let's walk through those one at a time. And the first one is orientation. And Drew, one of the things that I've realized is that a new member process in a church is literally an onboarding process. So patient apprenticing could begin for an individual just by participating in a new member process. What do you see as the value of a new member process for individuals coming into the life of the church?
Well, I love how you phrased it, Charlie, making outsiders insiders. I think that's a very simple way of describing what we're going for here. And it's really the same thing we're talking about, right? It's what you're doing is you're taking somebody who God is calling to join, and you are orienting them so that they become a relational insider. They have the capacity to become a value carrier. They have a general awareness of who you are, all those different dynamics. And if you've ever been in an environment where you're the new guy, then this is a lot easier. You can kind of reflect on your own experience and think, what was that like? I think what can be challenging if you're a team leader, you're so familiar with everything, you make assumptions. I've had the privilege of having some great staff people that I've been able to orient, and a few have been around and been very perceptive. And I remember one person sat me down one time and they helped me to orient them. They knew enough to know what they needed to know. And I remember them telling me, Drew, I can't know what I don't know about this organization. I know every organization, every church I've been a part of, there are unspoken things that just are part of how you operate. And I need you to help me know what those are so that I can be a good fit here. And I thought that was very perceptive, but it's that idea. Basically, they were saying is they were asking me to help them become an insider. And that person's now a major leader in our church and doing great. But I thought that's the right question for us to consider. And, that person had a lot of experience and knew to ask that question, but that stuck with me because I realized I need to be thinking that on behalf of people who don't have the years of experience that this particular pastor had to know to ask that so that they can have access to that same type of opportunity.
That's good. So there's a process for us to be oriented as we come into congregations, but ministries need the same thing. And so here are a few best practices that have been helpful for me. One of the assumptions that I make as I orient individuals is that their process of orientation into the church didn't fully stick. And so I began by clarifying the big picture and the desired outcomes of the congregation. I do understand that some people have heard that before, and sometimes people can articulate that. But it's my experience that a lot of that doesn't stick the first time. And so I think it's important to be sure people understand, what is the big picture of our congregation. And I think it's also important for them to understand the values of ministry. What does it look like for ministry to be done well? Whether we talk about relationships or whether we talk about equipping or whatever, to the extent that you can help people understand what the important values are in the community, that can be super helpful. I also think it's really important for them to understand how the ministry that you're orienting them to fits into the big picture. I've had that experience, for instance, in hospitality ministry, people handing out bulletins, not understanding how what they were doing was actually really important. They were welcoming people to be ushered into the presence of God. And they didn't see it that way until I was able to help them see that they're an integral part of making it happen on Sunday morning. So I think that's really important to make that linkage. Lastly, it's always important to be sure that they understand their specific role. We talked about role descriptions last time. We talked about how those fit in to an invitation process. Again, I would not assume that people have gotten it just because you've sat down with them one time. And so I just find that it's important to repeat that, really reinforce that, explore what perceptions or questions they have about the role that they're going to have. So those are some of the things that have been helpful in my experience. Drew, what stands out for you in your experience as you orient people into ministry?
I think what you're saying, Charlie, about making the assumption that the basics didn't stick. And I have been snake bit a lot, and not where other people have done me wrong, but where I did not do what was needed for somebody else, because I assumed that what I have accumulated in 15 years of relational ministry, or, now I'm on 18 and a half years or close to 19 years on Antioch staff. There is no way that somebody could step in and just have all that random knowledge that I have, things that I don't ever pause to think about because it's so ingrained with me. And, going back to this, why we always do the passion for Jesus and purposes on his earth slide, in my mind, I'm like, that's so obvious. That's just obvious. That's who we are. And so I'm very tempted then to skip steps like that with somebody and maybe jump right to brass tacks about, some very specific elements of their job responsibilities without really taking the time to clarify why we do what we do and how what they're doing fits within the greater whole. And if you don't do that, then, what ends up happening is 2-3 years from now, some major decision gets made where a person made a judgment call and they made a decision that you're not happy with. And in reality, it goes back to, you didn't ever clarify up front why they're doing what they're doing. And that's not a one-time thing. And I think we'll get into some of this, but with later teaching, is there's an ongoing repetitive nature of clarifying with people and not making the assumption that they went to the new members class or completed a training school or signed off on a document related to their employment, that they somehow now have internalized the vision and the values of the church.
Yeah, that's good, Drew. The second value really builds on the first. And the second driver is startup training, really focuses on launching new servants. And, to be clear, there's all kinds of startup training. There's all kinds of apprenticing that is going to happen over and over again as you grow an individual over time. You were just mentioning, almost 19 years. Obviously, there's been lots of training that you've received. As we talk about patient apprenticing in this context, we really are talking about the first time that someone is stepping into a new ministry. It might be a new job, but as individuals are entering into a whole new role that they've never had before, that's where we have to establish what do they need to know day one. And our goal is pretty simple. We want them to be confident and competent as they begin.
Yeah, Charlie, I think this is so good. I'm reminded of a few situations I've had recently where I've actually am working with somebody who has been a part of the broad organization I serve with for years, one of them longer than I have, but still recognize the importance of them having a clear startup training as they move into a new role, where I realized, my assumption was this person has been around and is familiar and will know what they're doing, but they're actually taking on a new job assignment. And so in both instances, I met with a couple different people, and I was like, okay, this is your start date. This is going to be, and we'll get into this here in a second, your first day. This is, just lining out the plan and making sure that I don't minimize those steps. But really, I would say anybody stepping into any new role needs some kind of clear startup training that's defined, that has a specific start time and date and all of that. Otherwise, what you end up happening is somebody kind of slides into a role and never got what they needed to succeed. So Charlie, as we move into this next slide about adult learning research, I think this is a significant point, and this is something I got from you, is a recognition that we have to be aware of how people learn to apprentice them. And there's a temptation I find in organizations where we want to check the box that we did something without asking the question of whether or not what we did was effective. And so this could be the case where we could have a startup training plan for a person that could be walking them through a manual and having them sign a few documents and assuming that they know what they're doing. But that's actually not at all how people learn. And, even if you maybe had some teachings that you had them sit through, that's still not really how people learn. And this says adult learning research, but I'm going to draw on my oatmeal illustration from earlier, because I think that is a great, maybe a way to wrap our heads around what we're talking about here. If I had taught my children how to start a gas stove where I tell them to push it in, wait till it ignites, look for the blue flame, and then turn it to medium, what parent in their right mind would trust that their children would be able to operate a gas stove at that point? Even with my kids, what I did was I modeled to them, and this is the scariest part of making oatmeal is, if you've ever done a gas stove before, if the igniter does not light, then you are now flooding your house with natural gas. That is a significant problem, right? And having an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old manage that process is a little hair raising. And so because of the stakes that were involved with my kids, I explained it to them, but then I showed them multiple times where I did it, but then I had them do it and I stood right there. And actually with each of my kids, there tended to be a moment where they didn't do it right. And it wasn't a problem because I was having them do it, but I was standing next to them. We were talking about it. And then I was able to correct it for them, then have it try it again. And referencing a point you made earlier, I was in dialogue with them the whole time. I was helping them to see this is what it feels like if it happens well. This is what it feels like if it's not going well. We're debriefing on the back end. It's very tactile. And ultimately, I didn't feel confident until they had done this process on their own multiple times, and we'd had the chance to talk about it to then feel comfortable to leave the room while they did this process. And so I like using that illustration because I think anyone who's a parent or worked with children, you can maybe immediately see what we're talking about here. But I don't see any reason to think that just suddenly goes away for adults. I think we're the same way. And I think if, picturing as a church staff member, if I'm engaged in some kind of pastoral follow-up with somebody, yeah, I mean, that's also playing with fire, and I'm probably going to need an apprenticing process to where we feel comfortable that somebody can navigate that well. So I just want to keep this in front of us, because when we're onboarding people, we have to really see that these elements need to be there. And I'm not saying that that needs to be there for every little instance of what they're going to do at their job, but I do think that we need to be prayerful about what would it look like for this person to be fully launched into their new responsibility, especially the things that carry a lot of weight and importance. And have we put the time into it to do this well? So you can kind of look at this as a three-legged stool of teaching, modeling, and experience. And that last little phrase, with debriefing. A pastor of mine, as a grown up, who's now with the Lord, had this phrase that it's not just experience that counts, but it's evaluated experience that counts. That's really where we learn the most. And so, we can see this as a three-legged stool. If you start taking out legs, then people are not going to get the experience ultimately, or the confidence that they need to do this responsibility. Charlie, what have you seen with this?
Well, as we think about startup training, here's a few best practices that have really guided me. And one is to begin by interviewing people. If I were interviewing you, Drew, I want to know what you already know. I need to assess your existing competencies, and that's only going to happen if I might already know, but if I don't know you well, I need to take the time to figure out what your experience and knowledge is. Secondly, I need to really reinforce the vision's desired outcomes. I need for you to be super clear on where we're going, and especially for whatever you need day one. Need to prioritize what people need to begin well. I have been convicted of telling people too much before they started, just drowning people in information and complexity. And I learned to kind of resist that temptation. Really, what you need is be prepared for day one, and then another session or plan, to keep helping you grow. Obviously, we need to honor just exactly what we talked about in terms of the 10, 20, 70% principles. And, the best system I have for that is just the buddy system. If I connect you with someone who's really good at what you're being apprenticed in, not only do you have someone to model after, but you have someone to have a relationship with who can help you debrief, which is the last point. It is very important to debrief initial ministry experiences. If I can do that right afterwards, right after a service, right after an event, right after you've preached or whatever, to me, that's a really fresh way of getting people to dialogue about what they've experienced, what they would do differently. Sometimes you need to wait a couple of days, but whatever the best context is, I think it's really important to allow people to reflect upon what they just experienced and highlight the challenges that they had, as well as things that they learned from that process. So a lot of listening with questions in this whole process of startup training. Drew, one of the challenges I've had, and you kind of referred to it a few minutes ago, is that it's really easy to train people the way you want to be trained. But obviously not everyone thinks like you and I. So what is that's my challenge in startup training. What's your challenge?
Yeah, I think it comes down to one word, and that's time. And if we want, I think we get into adult learning preferences, we get into the things that we're saying here. And a lot of it is, have we actually spent enough time to really listen well? To, experiential learning sounds awesome. I don't think anybody's going to argue with us. I would question, though, if you're in a leadership position, are you creating enough time so that you can actually do that process well? When we lecture people, typically what that comes down to is we're short on time. And so the easiest way for me to impart a lot of information to you quickly is for me to walk through a list and lecture you on what I want you to know, then walk out of the room. And that's fine. I can give you that information, but if I really want you to be good at what it is, then it's going to be me creating experiences with you, spending time with you where necessary, modeling for you. And the crucial part of this is that last point, debriefing with you. So If I was going to get very practical, I think almost every church could benefit from having a clear onboarding process, which, I think can be both the basics of what are your communication styles, what are your, do you have a phone system, an email system, and having somebody walk a person through all of that. So that third point, they can prioritize what they need to begin well. But then secondly, if you're in more of a leadership supervisory role, what you're also doing is orienting them to the role, identifying what are the major areas of emphasis. And then I try to schedule a lot of meeting rhythms where I overdo it up front so that I'm carving out time to be with that person. And then I'll typically tell them, we're going to meet really consistently weekly. I'm going to make sure I have you in a weekly team meeting. I'm going to do a lot of check-ins with you. I just do a lot of that up front. So I'm creating time. And this is when I'm doing it well. And then in those meetings, I'm spending a lot of time asking questions. What did you learn? And what I try to do with this is have an awareness, actually, even going back into our last training on the fit process of, I want to identify somebody's coming into this role and there's some awareness of these are areas we feel like they're really ready. But then this is an area where there might be a little bit of a risk involved, or maybe there's an identified growth area. So normally, hopefully that's an open conversation, even going back to the interviews. But then that's the type of stuff I'd hit this first week. So I can think of one person that joined our team where what I identified is they did not have the relational capital that was needed. So we started meeting and I was very intentional about, I'm going to introduce you to a lot of different stakeholders and I'm going to follow up with you and just dialoguing. What are you learning about these people as you get to know them? What are the challenges? What are, so all that comes down to time. And I found if you're a pastor, creating time means being intentional about putting it in your schedule in advance before that person's first day. Otherwise, you wake up 2 months later and you realize, I just have not given them what they need so they can get connected. Now, Charlie, this really bleeds into this last point of belonging. There's a startup training is maybe the more formal side of it, but one of the key outcomes is ultimately we want people to belong. We want them to have a sense of being connected into a team. And I think most pastors are in ministry because you want to be with people. And I think most people join your staff because they have a heart for relationship. But in the intensity of ministry, this can quickly become an afterthought or an assumption that relationship will just naturally happen rather than a non-negotiable priority that is really important. So can you take us into just what belonging looks like and maybe some of what you've discovered that allows a person to experience this very early on when they join your team?
Yeah. Over the course of my time in ministry, I have realized that this is the glue that keeps people connected and wanting to remain and be a part of a ministry team. Because I am more of a thinker than a feeler, I can sometimes lose sight of this, but relationships is tremendously important. And even we were talking a few minutes ago about my move to Boston at 58. When you go through that kind of change and you lose all your people, all your friends, and you go to a brand new place, it really reinforces how valuable it is. You can kind of lose sight of it when you already have built-in relationships. But I have literally been learning this lesson as I have been moving some in my 50s and 60s. So I think it's tremendously important. It's not particularly complex. The few best practices I have for you and for our listeners is simply, it sounds silly that we would need to ensure that names are known, but I've been in a lot of meetings where we didn't take the time properly for people to be introduced to one another. And so I always try to catalyze that, not necessarily with the entire team. If there are 15 people in the room, that's really difficult, but you can break people up into pairs, give them, 3 minutes to introduce themselves to one another and just do that over and over again, which means that you just have to tell stories a little bit at a time. Sometimes it's great to take a retreat and spend, significant chunks of time sharing testimonies and your own story. But sometimes you just have to break that up into little pieces. Obviously, you need to be intentional about using team building strategies. Sometimes even silly questions give way to helping individuals kind of have some frame of reference for the individuals that they are serving with. So, Drew, these are simple, but they do take time, and you do have to focus on them. What are some of the ways in which you build community among the teams you serve on?
If you're with a church staff, I would consider for somebody's first day having a lunch if you can, where you invite the whole team they're going to serve on and have a meal together. There's something about eating together that helps with this. If I were doing maybe a launch team or some type of volunteer ministry team, I might have everybody over for something at my house, maybe to kick off a new semester. Like I remember, doing whether it's college ministry or other forms of adult ministry that tend to operate on a school year cycle. Maybe a couple of times a year, you invite everybody that's going to serve in the ministry over, and don't have a big, workflow agenda, but maybe play some games, introduce one another around dinners. And I think having some intentionality around testimonies can be great. So I appreciate that you put that on there, where even if you're having a hour meeting with any kind of frequency and you have people share their 5-minute story, that doesn't take that much of your meeting time. And you do that for 6 months. And by the end, there'll be a sense of connectedness. So much of this one comes down to, I would imagine most people in ministry, what to do to build a sense of belonging. But the question is, are you keeping a focus on the importance of doing this, or does this become an afterthought or an assumption? That tends to be the danger zone. And I think anybody in ministry would recognize that at times we've taken our teams for granted and haven't spent the relational time we need for people to feel connected. So let's hit a few conclusions of what we hit. First, apprenticing is a model that's valued by God. So this is the way that He leads us, and this is the example that we see of how God has moved through His church. Is there is this pattern of God imparting and then using us to impart to others. And so it blows me away as you read in John's gospel, first and foremost, even with Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And I think one of the most profound verses is in John 16, where Jesus says, it's actually for your good that I'm going, because unless I go, I'm not going to send the helper to you, the advocate. If you go back a few chapters, you see this verse that we have here on this slide, that the Holy Spirit, what He's doing is He's teaching us all things and reminding us of everything that Jesus said to us. So Jesus apprenticed us, and then the Holy Spirit is in an ongoing way, both coaching and apprenticing us. But that immediately turns around as we get to this next slide. That immediately turns around into what we see in the ministry of the early church. And I think it's important to recognize that apprenticing is an experiential-based process that equips servants to begin well. And so even as we are receiving this from God, what we're also doing then is ensuring that we are modeling this for others. And I think the ministry of Paul stands out to me as such an incredible example of this. There's so many different verses that we could draw from. But this passage here in Philippians chapter 4, verse 9, that it's whatever you have learned or received or heard or seen. It's like all these different ways of learning, some of which are formal and some of which are the natural byproduct of living life together. What he's saying is, I am modeling for you in my formal teaching, but also in my very lifestyle, what it means for you to walk with God. And it strikes me, many of Paul's churches, he started those over the course of several weeks. Like this was not a classroom strategy where people were certified by him to then lead. This was Paul spending a lot of time with them and modeling for them, with teaching to be sure, and then later, obviously, with his letters and follow-up visits. But first and foremost, a very hands-on experiential model. And that is actually the Jewish rabbi system. And they have this word in Hebrew that is to walk. And it literally was, you were in the footsteps of somebody, and that's the way that you were learning, not this industrialized education approach where we walk you through a curriculum and assume that you've got it. And so I think that just becomes an important part of how we are ultimately brought into ministry. Charlie, take us into this next slide as we summarize some conclusions about apprenticing.
Yeah, so part of the process is competency-based, because I've got to figure out what experiences you've had and build upon those and not be redundant unless that redundancy is really important or it's something that you don't yet understand about our organization. So it's very much a come and see, come and follow me, remain in me process. And lastly, apprenticing is a relational process, which we emphasize through the driver of belonging. It's so important to drive the values of community into the process of ministry. And truth be told, this is a particularly challenging one for me. I can easily move beyond this too quickly. And so this is a good reminder for me. Drew, I consider apprenticing more of an art than a science. There's not a script, there's not a book, there's not a special experience, one-time deal. It really is an ongoing process of my investing in you or anyone with a listening ear to what you need, what's working, what's not working. There's no magic dust. There's not a perfect process. It really requires that I be sensitive to the experience that you're having, ask you lots of questions, and as you said earlier, really invest the time so that you can get what you need. Unfortunately, my tendency is to stop that process too soon, to gain confidence that you know what you're doing and convince myself that I know that you're ready and just kind of throw you in the deep end. Drew, as you think about apprenticing within the world that you serve, what are you seeing as it relates to apprenticing?
With all the teaching that we're going to do as part of this process, we go back to that first slide. If I had to pinpoint what I consider to be probably the greatest block in most churches that I work with, it's right here. It is skipping the step of apprenticing or shortchanging that process and putting somebody into ministry to where that person's not properly apprenticed into this role to where they can actually do well. So going back to where I started with my illustration, I had faith in my children. I had clarity of what I wanted to do. I correctly intuited that they were capable of doing it. So all of those things were right, but it wouldn't have worked if I didn't apprentice them so that they can then cook the oatmeal. And I think that same thing is true in ministry. So often we see people and we discern the call of God on their life. We see the potential. We can easily identify some wonderful spiritual gifts and how it ties in with the vision of the church. And there's a temptation then to say, great, now go for it. And we empower them, or in our minds, that what we're doing is we're empowering them. But in reality, we have not actually apprenticed them so that they can be fruitful in this role. And, the sad tendency, what tends to happen is if you do that, the person goes out, they do the job for a while, and a year later, you realize things aren't going well. And so a lot of pastors swing back the other direction, and that's where we start to get controlling. I actually very rarely see this process be controlling at the very beginning. I've seen it, and I think that is a tendency to be aware of, where we start off with kind of this anxious, controlling mindset. But the pattern I see for every one of those, I see 20 that where a person was prematurely empowered without appropriate apprenticing. They made a mess of the oatmeal. And then what ends up happening is the pastor then starts controlling them and micromanaging them because they never got apprenticed well in the first place. So that's a cycle that we can easily get into in ministry. I know that's never somebody's intention, but a lot of times it's a lack of intentionality, and we simply don't give it the time that it needs to do it right, or we shortchange the process, and that ends up being the result. And so I am convinced that if we'll do this process well, that the investment of time up front leads to so much more capacity later. And maybe to close out just with my story from my kids, today I invested the time to apprentice them well. And now every single morning I have 30 to 45 more minutes than I previously had. So it took a time investment of me. And that's the problem with this. When you look at this, and I've talked with enough pastors, there can be this feeling of how can I afford to spend the time I would require to onboard somebody and apprentice somebody well. And my challenge back to you is, how can you afford not to do that? Because I spent that time with my kids today, I actually have some extra capacity in the morning to expand my workout, get more time with God, get to work earlier, whatever the case may be. And so my overall health in life and ministry has expanded because I was willing to invest what ended up being a pretty small amount of time in the grand scheme of life. But if I hadn't done that, I'd still be cooking my kids oatmeal today and wouldn't have that time. And so I think that's the cycle we get into in ministry, where we just get so comfortable doing something, then we're intimidated by the time it would take to apprentice somebody well. So we either just start throwing dots in the dark, hoping that we can empower somebody, they'll magically figure out what to do. Or we do that a few times, we get burned and we say, I'm not doing that anymore. And we just start controlling the process. And what's sad to me is then the capacity for kingdom multiplication is really diminished. And ultimately that takes a big toll on the person who's leading. So I hope that everybody takes this to heart, because I think if this is something that we're willing to make the commitment to and invest in, and I love that you called it an art, because it is an art. And I have confidence that people in ministry, if they'll just spend the time and the intentionality, that's an art that you can master and do well. And in the end, is going to lead to a much faster and greater expansion of the kingdom.